Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Martin Willis, your host. And we have Bill Chuck. I'm real excited to talk to him again. Iconic Australian researcher. Charles Lear has been writing about him for years in the blogs. Now, I'll tell you, this was something I'm talked into. It's a little different. There are two streams going on right now on YouTube. One of them has live chat. One of them doesn't. One of them is vertical, and it's for your phone, for your iPhone or any type of phone like that. So I was talked into trying this. We'll see how it goes. I want to hear feedback from you as a listener. If you can comment on the show itself, tell me what you think of it. If it's confusing, I may not do it. I'm just trying this. This is an experiment, and Bill Chalker is my guinea pig on this tonight. And without choice, sorry, Bill, but we're just going to try this out and see how it works. I would love to hear your feedback on it. Supposedly it's supposed to be something good, but anyway, we'll see how it goes. Let's see. The blog for this week is part 2, the rise and fall of interest in the British crop circle mystery, starting back in the 1980s. And as you know, a lot of them were hoaxes, but there are still a lot of unexplained crop circles. It's a fascinating topic all on its own. So I want to thank you all in chat. I see the usual suspects, as they say, Dirk, also Christopher, and looks like a couple of new ones in there. Thank you for being here tonight. And so we are ready to bring in our guests. I'm glad to have him back. Now I got to explain, last time Bill was on, there was I think he said 50,000 houses were out of power, blackout. And I guess something happened again yesterday. But anyway, he's here now, and we have him in his home studio. Bill, welcome to the show. Welcome back.
Good to be here.
Yes.
Okay.
What's going on? Here we go. So yeah, we're just trying to work this out. So Bill, if you would, from the last time you were here, I know there was a lot of interest in the show. We had a lot of downloads in it. And again, the audio, we had the kookaburras out there making noise and everything. That was pretty wild. But yeah, so I know I asked you last time, but can you, if just for the person seeing you for the first time, you've been at this a long time. When did you first start your very first UFO investigation? Hang on, Bill. Try that again. Hang on just a second. All right, we're having a little trouble here. Try that again, Bill. When did you first start?
Yeah, I started my UFO interest pretty much around about 1966, but only got actively involved by 69, 70. And by then I was starting to do a lot of active research, field investigations, that kind of thing.
And, you've talked about this before. I think that there was sort of a lot of stigma involved in UFOs in Australia. So how did that work with your everyday life?
Well, I did in fact my everyday life, but I agree that the stigma wasn't just unique to Australia. The stigma was worldwide, and that was reflected a lot, particularly courtesy of the Condon Report that came out in 1969. And right. From that point of view, it kind of was an expression of that stigma, with sort of mainstream science in the form of Edward Condon describing the whole UFO subject as worthless and of no scientific merit. But here was I, a budding high school student in 1969, reading the Condon Committee report. I read it several times over a few months, and to me, it confirmed that there was a real problem and a real phenomenon. And from that point of view, started to investigate what was going on here in Australia in particular.
Right. And there are some great cases, but you were sort of drawn to the pre-1947. Is that right?
I guess that's one. The pre-1947 sightings were one area of interest, but what really drew me in was the science focus, or the suggestion that there was a real physical phenomenon going on, and that my first sort of focus was simply to examine whether there was a UFO reality, and then the next sort of priority was to establish whether that was alien or not, or some sort of prosaic kind of explanation. And through all that, I got exposed to a broad cross section of the UFO phenomenon in Australia. But the pre-1947 stuff was an area of interest to me as well, simply because if there were cases that were the same as what we're experiencing at that time back in the 20th century, then that sort of suggested that we've got a real enduring phenomenon there outside of the typical kind of military intelligence milieu. It didn't exist back in those early days, and so that's why I had the interest in historical cases.
Now, when you said that you were you had an interest back in high school, did you have like fellow high school buddies or anything that you talked to this about, or was this something you were just doing on your own?
There was interest from the point of view of other friends and students, and so that was an ongoing thing. And in fact, I had a number of my student friends helping me out on some of the early investigations. And back in 1969, for example, you know, I was sort of involved in doing field investigations, and I had various friends, local friends, that were assisting me in doing those field investigations. And my father at the time knew the local member of parliament in our state government, and it was on his property, the parliamentarian, Mr. Ian Robertson, a property at a place called Bunga Walban that had a quite a striking physical trace site where there was a saccharine crop or sugarcane crop that was affected or flattened out, and flood mitigation workers were kind of examining the site for flood mitigation work, but they observed top-shaped objects flying through the night sky and landing in that saccharine crop. So there was a direct implication with a UFO event.
And when you say that there was trace evidence, what type of trace evidence is that? What you just said?
Yeah, there was a large amount of flattened sugarcane crop, flattened out into a circular area.
Oh, that type.
And
okay. Mm-hmm.
That caused quite a sensation. It was widely reported across Australia, and in fact, I've seen reporting on that case overseas as well. So it did get a lot of press coverage. It was quite a media sensation in its time. You know, like in some respects, when the Condon Committee report came out in 1969, early 1969, it seemed to shut down a lot of UFO interest in the United States. But here in Australia, we had quite an extensive UFO flap, so to speak, of multiple sightings and close encounter sightings right across the country. So it was a very interesting time in Australia.
Now, where were you at that time? I'm trying to think. Was it South Wales, New South Wales? Is that where you were?
Yeah, New South Wales. It's I was in the north coast of New South Wales, up a place called Grafton, and that was my hometown. And so a lot of the local activity was happening and being monitored by me, and that was the case right through to about 1975. Well, actually, from 71, 72, I went to the University of New England at Armidale, which is, I guess, up in the mountainous region just to the west of Grafton. And I'm just trying to give a geographical kind of location to all this. And so I spent 3 years at the University of New England at Armidale, and there I had an active UFO group. and we were investigating a lot of things. And what was really quite striking is that by 1973, we were engaged in doing a field kind of investigation of a major intensive UFO flap on the Dorrigo Plateau. And luckily for me, it took me into the realm of direct witnessing of the UFO phenomenon, that kind of thing. And that was very striking for me.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know this is prior to that, but when I think it was, boy, I don't know if I have the date right or not, but was it 1966 when Westall happened?
Yeah, that's correct.
And
yeah,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
No, I just wondered if you had heard about it. I know you weren't really paying attention that much in 66. You said 1969, but had you heard of that case prior to when you started looking into this?
Yeah, there was sort of publicity given to it, but it was kind of a bit of a sleeper report. 1966 historically turned out to be a huge year for major UFO sightings, and it really kicked off quite early in 1966 with the famous Tully report up in far north Queensland. And that's where a banana farmer crossing his neighbour's property on a tractor at 9 o'clock in the morning in January 1966, thought he heard what it sounded like a air escaping, or he thought it might have been a problem with the tractor tire, but he stopped and then observed a dish-shaped object coming out of a tidal lagoon area quite close to him, within 20 yards, and out of the Horseshoe Lagoon rose a dish-shaped object, and it took off in a slight dive, and then he goes over to the lagoon and sees a swirling mass of water swirling in a clockwise position. It was all dark and bracken. Comes back an hour or two later, and then sees that the reeds that were in the lagoon itself had risen to the surface, and there was like a natural pontoon of intertwined swordgrass reeds, so tightly wound in a clockwise direction that people were able to climb onto that floating pontoon of swordgrass reeds, and it could support the weight of a man. And it was around about 28 to 30 feet in diameter, approximately the size of the UFO. So it was a very striking physical trace case. And that kicked off the year, so to speak, in Australia in 1966.
Wow. Okay. Yeah. I think it's possible either we touched on that at last time we spoke, or maybe perhaps I heard about that. But yeah, that sounds interesting. But I do want to skip back because I know that you investigated kind of a interesting. I'm trying to think of the 1868 Parramatta case. Is that something that you'd be able to talk a little bit about?
Yes. It's a bit confusing here with there's quite a time delay going on. Anyway, the Parramatta case that you're talking about, I didn't learn of that until I moved to Sydney full time and there to live and work in 1975. And the local UFO group had been established since about 1956. It was one of the earliest and longest duration UFO groups in the world, in fact, 55, 56. And the then sort of honorary president of the group, Fred Phillips, I used to spend a fair bit of time with him in his personal library, and he had a huge interest not only in UFOs but the paranormal, the occult, psychic type stuff. So visiting his place with his massive library was always a real pleasure. And it was during one of those visits that he showed me what appeared to be the reconstructed journal entry by a Parramatta surveyor called Frederick William Birmingham. and this purported to describe the landing of a UFO, or what he referred to as a flying ark, in Parramatta Park. This is a very large residential parkland area at Parramatta. Parramatta was our first real city that developed the original first settlement of Australia by the British back in 1778. That had become a bit of a cesspool, polluted, very poorly managed, and so they developed the first city as such at out to the west, probably about 20 kilometres away, and that became the first major city development in Australia. And it was at that location that Frederick Birmingham had his sighting. Now, my initial reaction to seeing this document was I wondered whether it was some sort of more contemporary hoax, and so off I went to the State Library, the Mitchell Library, to the research department, and started looking at all the historical newspaper accounts, that kind of thing. And what really amazed me was I was starting to find very clear evidence that Frederick Birmingham did exist. He was a surveyor. He was on 2 occasions an alderman or a politician on the local council, and was quite well regarded as a surveyor and engineer, and involved in kind of council work involving like the repair and maintenance of the local waterworks, all that kind of stuff, to ensure that there was a clean water supply for the growing city of Parramatta. So the guy existed. I came across maps and survey maps that he had done, and so I was able to verify fairly quickly that, yeah, okay, Frederick Birmingham was a real person, but the question was this document a real product of Frederick Birmingham? And sure enough, over a long period, we were able to determine that he actually described that story, and it got documented in contemporary newspapers, and even as certainly by about 1872, 73, there was documentation of newspaper accounts in the Parramatta area. So the story itself was being described, and there was a local horticulturalist or seed merchant who took a particular interest. He also had an active side interest of historical studies, local interest, that kind of thing, and he actually encountered Birmingham before he passed away in 1892, and was able to secure some of the original documents. And it was only in the last year that actually I went to the University of Sydney Library in their rare records section, and was able to find there was like a dossier written by, well, actually prepared by Herbert Rumsey. He's the seed merchant or horticulturalist from the local area, and he had apparently donated that material to the library at some point way back in about, must have been the 1930s. And it turned out I was the first person to look inside that envelope.
Oh.
And oddly enough, the envelope that he had this material in was a seed packet from Rumsey. And I'm looking inside this, not expecting to see anything, but as it turned out, it had an original picture of a airship that Birmingham was inspired to make based on his vision that he had in 1868. He described it as a vision, but he also had a daylight sighting in 1872, and it was so it was a very interesting report historically. No way to prove it, but it was certainly exciting for me after all these many years to actually hold in my hands his original drawing of the airship that he was inspired to make based on his experience back in 1868, and also handwritten material by him. He tried to sell his idea of an airship around Parramatta and in New South Wales. Didn't get too much interest but he actually went to the United States, and around about in the 1880s, and was there trying to get people interested in his project. A lot of competition back in those days for early airships.
Very, very interesting. Now, before we move on to, post 1947 and get back into other things that you research, there was also another thing you researched that was the 1927 Fernvale Mothman type situation. Can you talk about that?
Yep. Yeah, the Fernvale event from 1927 was a really interesting one. I'd heard about it courtesy of the Queensland group, the Queensland Flying Saucer Research Bureau, or it's now called UFO Research Queensland. And they didn't send, one of their members told me about it, but nobody in the group seemed to be particularly interested in investigating it. But I took an immediate interest in it, mainly because it was a very striking story. And I made contact with the gentleman who was 10 years old at the time in 1927. And I sent off a letter, and there was sort of silence for, I think, a couple of months. And out of the blue came this long letter about, I think about 15 pages or thereabouts, handwritten, in which he went to great detail describing the events. And essentially, his family, his parents were running, they were like share farmers, or they were hired to operate a dairy farm. And also there were pigs there that were fattened up, and that was the main sort of money supply ultimately. And so they were quite poor at the time, but it was they were living on the property. But what they observed was apparently a disc that flew over the property, traveled down the valley, and then appeared to land nearby. The family members and several locals visited that location, and they found a circular burn mark on the side of a hill within viewing distance of the property itself. And so that sort of was quite striking. Initially, they'd never seen anything quite like it. An object that appeared to be able to fly. It had no wings, was a disc-shaped looking thing, and it landed on a nearby hill. Now, that was observed at night time. And also there was other activity that seemed to herald a lot of unusual activity on that property, which involved the presence of people that you have to remember that back in 1927 at Wollumbar, or nearby Wollumbar, there was no real extensive usage of motor vehicles. That was a new thing. There was a lot of dairy farming and that kind of thing, but motor cars were a rare thing. And yet during all this event, which it took place over a 2-week period, there was a strange motor vehicle that turned up onto the property, drove onto the property. There were unusual people that would turn up, almost like a Men in Black type parallel. So it was a very unusual event. And there was also the presence of what appeared to be a bird-like creature that seemed to stand on 2 legs. This was quite large, the size of a, I don't know, a very, very large penguin. And both the gentleman that talked to me in later life and his brother witnessed what sounded like strange cackling or conversation going on. They looked up and they observed 2 of these bird-like things passing overhead, very large wingspan. And later, their father, or the gentleman's father, asked him to go out into the muddy road. There was no bitumen there, to retrieve the boots of a neighbour who the night before had a very frightening encounter with a bird-like creature the size of a large penguin that terrified the life out of this local guy, so much so that he ended up uprooting and taking his whole family and leaving the area in terror. So it was a lot of weird stuff going on during that period of time. So a very striking event, all played out in 1927, 20 years before Kenneth Arnold's historic sighting in 1947. And what was really quite crazy was that... Say again?
No, it's okay. Keep going.
Yep. Okay, what was very striking at the time was that he was an elderly gentleman when I spoke to him, in his 80s, but I was able to go to the location and talk to locals that were aware of this event, and was able to be taken to the actual location, shown the property, and get all this sort of extra information. So there was a degree of confirmation through the local community that this family had this experience, that the location, the property, was the scene of all this kind of bizarre activity. But the big impact on the farm and the local community was that that I mentioned earlier, the fattened pigs, which was the main money supply for the family. Actually, the pigs were apparently attacked during the night, and several of them were killed, and in some cases the only thing left of the pigs was a large pool of blood in the pigsty and around, as if somehow whatever was there had taken the pigs out of the sty, and these are big pigs, and had ostensibly consumed them or whatever, or taken them somewhere, but the only remains were a pool of blood and evidence of pig hair and that kind of thing. So it was a very bizarre event. A lot of disturbance amongst the local cattle, the dairy farm that they had. So there was quite a huge impact on the local community. You have to bear in mind, this was a remote kind of farming community, mainly dairy and stocks of pigs and that kind of stuff. So it was a very unusual and frightening event for the family and the local community.
Yeah, we've got a bit of hesitation. We are 10,000 miles apart, or so thereabouts, and so there is a little bit of a lag. But so just keep that in mind if you're listening. But so I want to ask you. I'm going to kind of put you on the spot and just ask you, what is the case that you really thought was spectacular, that one you personally investigated, that you really enjoyed and you like to actually talk about?
Yeah, mate, you're really putting me on the spot because I've got so many cases that fall into that kind of category.
I'll just choose one.
Choose one. Okay. Yeah. One of the most interesting ones for me would be the landing type case that occurred in Rosedale in 1980. And why I'm attracted to that was being having a chemist background. I was intrigued by the indication that there was physical evidence at the site, that kind of thing. A caretaker on the property at Rosedale in the Gisborne area of Victoria had actually witnessed what he first noticed as a sound disturbance, like some sort of aircraft coming in, a high-pitched whining noise. He comes out of the caretaker house that he had on this property, and thinking that there was some aircraft in trouble, looks out and sees what appeared to be a dish-shaped object, a dome thing with what appeared to be portholes around it, about 28 feet in diameter. And he observed that passing low over the property. It seemed to be heading towards a hay barn, quite a large hay barn, and then it seemed to deviate just to avoid colliding with the the hay barn, and then it seemed to go down another half a mile or so to the next paddock, where there was a 10,000 gallon water tank, and this object appeared to sit on top of the water tank. It came to a stop over the water tank, and then it appeared to slowly move off the water tank and land on the ground adjacent to the water tank. And what the caretaker can see and observe was that the cattle and horses on the property were in a state of total mayhem. They were bellowing and carrying on. It was a huge disturbance on the property. And as the caretaker, and we're talking about midnight or thereabouts, he realised he had to investigate. And so off he goes on a motorbike, driving along or riding along to the adjacent paddock. He could see that the livestock was tremendously disturbed. He goes through into the open paddock, could still see the object on the ground. And the closer he got, the clearer it became that this was not a helicopter or an aircraft or a vehicle of any mundane prosaic origin. This was clearly some sort of dish-shaped object of a fairly substantial size, as I said, about 28 to 30 feet in diameter. And he got to within about, say, about 30 or 40 feet, and he started to get very intimidated by what he was looking at. He's sitting there, he stops, and he's there on his legs, sort of sitting with the motorbike and using his legs to maintain balance. And at that point, the object suddenly rose up and tilted towards him so he could see the base of the object. And then he was hit by what seemed to be a blast of hot air. And from the bottom of the object, all this debris started to fall. And that debris consisted of cow patties or cow droppings, that kind of thing, dried out. And you have to remember, this time it was during a period of a heat wave, and there was a lot of loss of water. And so the caretaker's critical role was to ensure that there was plenty of water available in the water tank. And he used to check that by lobbing a stone or something like that into the water tank to make sure that he could hear that there was a large amount of water still present in the water tank. What he found on this occasion was that the water tank itself had drained. But these were discoveries that were in the following day. But with the object turning, it hit him with that blast of hot air, slowly moved away, and followed in a slow movement off into the distance and disappeared into the night. Needless to say, the caretaker was shocked, disorientated, started to experience all sorts of physiological effects. A very dramatic sighting with lots of physical evidence, lot of ground trace evidence. And the beauty of this case for me as a physical scientist was that all the physical evidence kind of connected with the sequence of events that were reported. So it was like all the physical evidence seemed to verify what the caretaker was reporting. So incredibly striking case. Myself, Keith Baskerville, and a local associate in Melbourne visited that site in late December of the same year, and the caretaker took us through the whole event, recreated the sighting. We spent all day with him and collected lots of physical evidence. And the analysis of those results was, it didn't come up with anything unknown or unexplainable, but it supported the fact that here was a real physical event, that somehow, whatever the object was, it created a disturbance, not only on the ground. The only clear difference was a difference in chloride levels. It was like a ring-shaped effect. The media got involved. They, Channel 9, one of the local TV networks, flew over, took a helicopter shot of the ground trace. So there was a lot of evidence there that we had to deal with, and And also it turned out that there was a parcel delivery van that went by during the night, and it was observed by the caretaker, and he apparently stopped on the side of the road and appeared to have seen the object on the ground as well. And there was a young girl living on a neighbouring property that also witnessed possibly the same object during the night when she woke up for a short time. So there was a lot of independent evidence confirming, I guess, the reality of the event. As to what it was very hard to determine. But that's one of my favourite physical trace cases, apart from Tully and apart from Westall. They're all these kind of quite striking, well-documented cases. I went beyond that and started to look at physical evidence for the much more controversial end of the UFO spectrum. That was alien abductions. So I started to investigate these sorts of cases, and lucky enough to have physical evidence in one such case. That's the Peter Khoury case, which I think I've talked to you a bit about before. But that was probably one of the most enduring and detailed case investigations that I've done, particularly in the alien abduction area.
Now, we have a lot in the States. We have a lot of cases, not a lot, but there are a number of them where there are police involved. And are there any good cases in Australia where there's police involved?
Well, look, there are quite a few. Like the one of the cases that introduced me to the subject here in the local area of Grafton, my hometown, in 1966, was sightings by local police officers. There were police officers at least 3 jurisdictions on the north coast. There was the Grafton area, the Casino area, and the Lismore area. So 3 different localities where police officers were involved in actually chasing UFOs across the countryside. So a lot of it was put down to astronomical explanations, but when you have objects sort of hopping into paddocks, landing and taking off, it's very difficult to reconcile that with astronomical explanations, that kind of thing. So there were those sort of police-related cases in 1966. Obviously, I wasn't directly investigating those cases as a youngster, but probably one of the more striking police events would have been from 1983 in a Melbourne suburb called Melton, and it was quite a striking case. It got wide publicity. It was reported in the media, reported in the papers, and providentially, I got the opportunity to talk to the police officers that had spent half the night on their night shift chasing a UFO across the local area. Now, we're talking an outer Melbourne suburb, Melton, and the police claimed that this thing looked like a Harrier jet, but was capable of hovering and reversing. So there was a lot of complexity to the case, and the witnesses were obviously quite credible. Indeed, the police officers reported to the local station that the object was heading towards the police station, and they were suggesting to the desk sergeant to get outside and look and observe to see if he could see the object approaching. And indeed, he went out to the front of the police station and witnessed the object coming over the police station, hovering. To him, it was unexplainable, and it was the same deal with the police officers that were out on patrol trying to capture this object to try and corner it, but it just kept eluding them over the space of an hour or two. So once again, a very complicated sighting that had a lot of police witnesses and thoroughly intriguing. But one of the bizarre aspects that at one point the police were following this object, and there's a facility called Rockbank which is a military intelligence listening array site. So there were various antennas and that kind of stuff that were used for monitoring of various target sites, mainly overseas type intelligence gathering, that kind of thing. So it's a very sensitive site. And during that night, the police witnessed the object that they'd been pursuing up to an hour and a half thereabouts during the night, actually approach the main antenna array of this military facility. It seemed to be moving towards the antenna array, looked as though if it kept going, it would collide with the antenna array, got quite close, and then started to slowly reverse and come back. And so it was a very striking case, and it was that particular aspect of the sighting that created a huge amount of controversy and concern amongst the military intelligence community. And that's why it became the target of a lot of official investigations. The RWF investigated. Providentially, when I rang the police station, at the time there were afternoon newspapers, and the event was being reported in the afternoon newspapers. And that's how I learned about the event. And I immediately called the police station. It turned out the police involved in the chase were just coming off shift. And the sergeant, who was also a witness, who I spoke to, said, "Do you want to talk to them?" I said, "Of course." And so I was talking to them fresh off the shift. And so therefore, this was a very sort of pretty quick follow-up of the case. And to me, it was very impressive. The police officers were quite credible. And later on, the RWF and other authorities were investigating the case as well. So that's a pretty striking police case.
That is great. Thank you for enlightening us on that. I have a question. This person, Jane, she is actually in Australia, and she wanted to know basically if you're going to go to the 60th Westall annual next year.
I certainly would. Sorry. Yep, I'd certainly like to be going to that event, and I'm looking forward to it, and I'm trying to schedule that in. So there'd be a lot of people interested in going to that anniversary event.
Right,
so
exactly.
Sure, answer yes.
Yeah. So I guess I want to touch on another case, as I mentioned earlier. But before I do, I just want to just say a couple things here because I have some people coming up this Thursday. This is everyone for watching here now or listening. I have Ryan Kralik on Thursday at 8 p.m. coming up this week. Next week we have a Philip Ledoux, I think his name is. He's produced a UFO video, and we're going to be talking about what inspired him to do that. Next week, actually on Thanksgiving, I'm going to put this Thanksgiving, look up that on the screen. We have Thanksgiving here in the United States. And so that day, I'm actually running a show. That's Thursday. It's going to be a pre-recorded show with Professor Matthew Shadegas. He's at a university, UAlbany, and they were just funded for UFO research, which I think is fantastic. So Matthew will be on. You can hear him. I know a lot of people get bored here on Thanksgiving night after they had their turkey dinner, so they're looking for something to do. So I invite you to come and check that out. I will be in chat if I can be here, and that's next week on Thursday. But thank you for that. So Bill, if you would just entice us on another one of the cases that you really enjoyed. Now, before you go there, I know you did some DNA research. Is that something that you think was a fascinating case?
Yeah, the DNA case you're referring to was the Peter Khoury case, and I wrote a whole book devoted to that. I think people need to understand that this is a very complex case, and And I wrote the book mainly as a kind of a way. The book is called Here of the Alien. You can see it in the background. The book was really a case study, and it was designed to attract people's attention, and also to highlight the fact that even in cases that involved alien abduction, there was the possibility of potentially retrieving physical evidence. In this case, it was in the form of a biological sample, a hair sample, ostensibly from what appeared to be female beings associated with this rather controversial and striking case. And it's a fairly confronting kind of story, but Peter Khoury was originally from Lebanon. As a young child, emigrated to Australia, got into the building industry, was involved in a lot of cement rendering and that kind of stuff. And he was probably the most unlikely UFO abductee person that you would have, but he had this encounter. As it turned out, there were a series of encounters, 1988, 1992, and a number of other associated events. And that's why it's very difficult to summarise. And so I encourage people either read the book or go to my main OzFiles site, put in Peter Khoury's name. There's also a connected site that I have that you can access via the OzFiles website that I've got, called the Alien DNA Paradigm site. And that has a lot of information. And I know the case has been the subject of a lot of attention lately, and people down here in Australia wonder why it's taken so long for, I guess, the general UFO scene, particularly in the United States, to be aware of this case. I had a book published by a US publisher in 2005. Multiple reports I've written on the case from the year 2090, actually 1999 was the first written detailed account in terms of the Alan Hynek organisation, the Centre for UFO Studies, International UFO Reporter, published a paper by me called Strange Evidence. So there's been this sequence of investigations, both of the 1988 case, the 1992 case, which led to the discovery of the hair sample. And so to me, it's a very strong evidential series of cases that support the reality of this case. And the DNA, and a lot of people misunderstand the DNA evidence, and I really encourage people to dig into the detail. And that's why when I published the book, I wanted to make sure that the detailed report and analysis by the biochemists involved was there as an appendix, so that anybody with a biochemistry background could read that report and know that it was done by experienced biochemists. At the time of the book publication, I wasn't able to identify the key people involved, and as it stands now, the main coordinating scientist has come out, and that's Dr. Horace Drew, who was formerly a member of the major science research organisation called the CSIRO here in Australia. So he's one of the chief biochemists, well-credentialed scientist, the co-author of one of the standard textbooks for biochemists called Understanding DNA. So impressive credentials, but he was the main guy supervising this investigation in terms of the biochemistry, and there were a number of analysts involved, but we've decided that the identity of some of the other biochemists is not appropriate to share. So the data's there, the information's been verified to a certain extent, and it seemed to imply that in the hair sample, it appeared to be of a hybrid nature. And this is something that people need to understand. People get hung up on the basically thinking that they understand the DNA investigation, but most people don't seem to take the time to examine the detail. And we did it in a couple of phases. We examined the hair shaft. It showed an Asian Mongoloid DNA type sequence present in the hair shaft, and in the root of the hair, which we did subsequently, it seemed to show a different sequence. And that kind of anomaly between the shaft and the root of the hair sample shouldn't be occurring in normal human hair or human DNA. And yet here we had evidence of what appeared to be a hybrid sample. Very unusual. And that certainly intrigued the biochemists that were involved in the investigation as well. I should remind folks that I'm not a biochemist. I'm an industrial chemist and trained in industrial inorganic chemistry. And so I had a fairly rapid learning curve to acquaint myself in biochemistry. I wasn't completely unexposed to biochemistry, but certainly I had good people to guide me through this process. And so we've had a lot of opportunities to verify and review the DNA work. And so to those that want the detail, read the book Hair of the Alien or go to my site, Alien DNA Paradigm, which you can access via the Ozfiles blog site that I've got. So very complicated investigation.
Yes, hang on. There we go. So yes, wow, that's yeah. So I encourage people to go to the website. I will have that in the show notes, so check that out. I was thinking, Bill, that New Zealand is like, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000 miles away offshore from where you're at. And do you ever look into any cases in New Zealand?
Well, there's been a long history of well-established UFO groups in New Zealand, and Susie Hansen's one of the more prominent researchers, and in fact, she's an experiencer herself. And there have been a lot of intriguing cases, and I've been to New Zealand and investigated a number of those kind of cases. One of the most interesting cases for me was a whole complicated series of events that played out at a location called Gisborne on the North Island. And these were events that took place mainly during the 1970s and involved a number of people claiming to have had close encounter events and alien abduction experiences. Probably the most concentrated grouping of abduction-related cases that I've come across in my experience are all located in this Gisborne area. And people need to understand that New Zealand is earthquake prone, and that kind of stuff, and there's a lot of speculation that maybe this accounts for a lot of the UFO activity. But again, it's all speculation. But one thing for sure, the Gisborne location, particularly during the 1970s and into the 80s, has been the location of a lot of ongoing UFO activity and an incredibly high concentration of UFO abduction type reports as well. And having talked to some of the key witnesses who experienced all this, I was quite impressed with the quality of witnesses, and it's hard not to be interested in that kind of complex case, and it provides a lot of evidence for the possible reality of these kinds of events.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So after all your years of research, what patterns or consistencies do you see across like historic cases compared to modern? Are there any consistencies?
Yeah. You ask all the easy questions, Martin. Not really. But the phenomenon I think has been extraordinarily robust. There's a lot of consistency in terms of comparing current data. People argue that it's all about kind of orbs and rather distant encounters, but really the evidence, when you start to dig into it, the robust nature of the UFO phenomenon, the physical encounters, the close encounters with large structured objects, that continues. It's just that it's harder and harder for researchers to stay on top of these kind of cases because they're being reported to all sorts of diverse locations. You know, even Australian cases get reported to US sites, and very rarely does that information come back. We have to go chasing all that kind of events. So there's still a lack of coordination, but there's no doubt that the phenomenon is robust. It's been continuous. It has very similar enduring characteristics over the decades. There was a period of robust openness with regard to abduction reports. Some people believe that the controversy has died out, that there are no abduction cases, but there are many abduction cases still ongoing, quite striking cases, and most of those don't get reported to the general media simply because of the, I guess, the problems of people being socially isolated by it, you know, the stigma of it, that kind of thing. But the abduction phenomenon seems to be real and enduring, and certainly the close encounter events are real and enduring as well. Anybody who says that it's all about orbs and lights in the sky, that kind of stuff, haven't really gotten into the deep dive yet, and that they need to understand that it's an ongoing phenomenon. And it is one really good thing to see that there's a high level of interest, even government interest in America. Here in Australia, our own government seems to have put their head in the sand like the proverbial ostrich, and they're not encouraging open official investigations. They stopped that quite some while ago, but it seems clear evidence that there's ongoing military interest as well, based on my contacts with various people and others that have had similar connections as well. So I don't know whether that ends going on, and it's an enduring, remarkable phenomenon that's worldwide.
Right. So, you know, the buzzword, I see there's a question in chat. I'm going to ask that in just a minute. But here, the buzzword is NHI, non-human intelligence. Is there any one particular case that you could say that there was definitely something that appeared to be a non-human intelligence?
Well, again, the Peter Khoury case is a remarkable example of that. The case is incredibly controversial, confronting, and yet here we have DNA evidence that not only supports the case, but seems to give controversial hybrid DNA evidence that supports it. You know, surely that would be a wake-up call that people, rather than ridicule these kinds of cases, they should be examining it and looking at it in an open-minded scientific way. And in Peter Khoury's case, I have to say that the evidence supports it rather than detracts from it. So I'm sure that there will be people here that will attack the case. They've been doing that for decades, etc. We're used to that, but more often than not, those people that are negative about the case haven't even bothered to look at the details. They take all their assumptions, and yet they don't examine the case in detail. I find that, you know, pretty bizarre. You know, if you're going to comment about a case, you should be at least informed about it and understand the basics of it, and have taken the time to examine it, rather than, I guess, reveal prejudices that are informed by a lack of being informed about the subject. You know, so much of that's happening at the moment. People making often quite ridiculous claims and accusations and criticisms, and yet they themselves don't even bother to investigate or research the material. That's bizarre. And from a scientist's point of view, you really need to be informed. You really need to do the deep dive. You need to examine the evidence, and there's a lot of it. So,
Yeah, to me, that sounds like almost like a smoking gun type of situation. It sounds, if the evidence is there. I mean, I'm surprised that more people aren't talking about it. It's not known out there more than it is. And what you're talking about with the skeptics is, I remember Stanton Friedman used to say, by proclamation instead of investigation, that these people make their comments about.
well, I think as a researcher, I think you have to get a bit of a thick skin. One gets used to uninformed commentary, that kind of stuff. And I just wish that people who like to get aggressively involved in various discussions, that they are at least informed of the basic facts of the case rather than making a knee-jerk reaction and an uninformed one. So, things are, I guess, on the upswing. There's a lot of interest, a lot of acknowledgement of the subject these days, and so that's an encouraging thing to see. And I just hope that, particularly more internationally, that there are deeper and more informed kind of official investigations as well, rather than, in our case here in Australia, a suggestion that there's nothing to it. And yet the history of the subject in my own country reveals that there's a hell of a lot to it, and a lot of official documentation that is not well known. And one would hope that people would spend the time to examine that. I know I've been documenting it for decades, and it's kind of frustrating sometimes to see the kind of empty words that are often expressed, particularly by politicians and others that should be better informed in terms of their own government involvement in the subject over the decades.
Here's a question for you here. Are there any Australia accounts from the years of World War II in the Pacific, any involving military of the day?
Right. Yeah, there certainly are. There are cases, I'm just trying to think of them off the top of my head. There was a case that was quite controversial, but involved a bomber pilot who actually went on to become a member of the Queensland Flying Saucer Research Bureau. I'm thinking of, I think his name was Ricky Royal, and he had an experience of encountering, he was on a bomber and encountering a UFO. The close proximity to the UFO affected the electronics of the aircraft. That obviously had a very striking impact on the gentleman concerned, Ricky Royal, so much so that he became one of the foundational members of the Queensland Flying Saucer Bureau. Both the Queensland group and Ricky Royal in particular were the subject of ASIO attention. That's the domestic Australian Intelligence Security Service. ASIO stands for the Australian Security and Intelligence Organisation. And there was a report done that you can locate in the government archives now that goes into some detail about all the members of the early flying saucer group in Queensland. And it was sometimes not a very well-informed or positive kind of take on them. It seemed like back in the 1950s, everything was kind of subject to the lens of the Red Scare, communism, that kind of stuff. Anybody who advocated connections with the, for example, Russia, one of the major cases that, historically speaking, was the Tunguska case of a possible UFO event back in 1908. And the Queensland group back in the 1950s actually had the temerity, I say the foresight, to actually directly engage with the Russian scientists that were writing reports about the Tunguska case in 1908. And they got responses from the Russian scientists that, of course, given the day, the Cold War era, attracted the attention of our local security organisation, which misunderstood why these civilian UFO flying saucer groups were interested in connecting with Russian authorities. They weren't about spreading communism in Australia. They were, like me, looking for information about intriguing events. And when a Russian scientist, for example, reports about the Tunguska case or Russian cases, naturally, researchers like here in Australia or in America take an interest. And yet, intelligence groups of the day saw that as evidence of communist leanings, that kind of thing. And so it's probably a bit more enlightened these days, but still there's always that misunderstanding that comes from a lack of awareness of what's being examined, what's being researched. And it can be easily remedied by doing a degree of proper research, being aware of their own files, that kind of stuff. And that's what I keep reminding various government people that I interact with. Have a look at your own files, for God's sake. Review them. There's plenty of evidence there. And they keep saying, well, they've examined the subject, there's nothing, just any scientific merit, and yet their own scientists, their own pilots, their own defence officials have had their own sightings, and yet there's no kind of modern awareness. People seem to have a very short-term memory when it comes to the UFO subject, and yet it's all there. It's a very enduring phenomenon, and plenty of documentation.
Right, right. Is there another, like to say, eventually we're all going to get replaced? Is there another Bill Chalker coming up? I mean, are there any young people really involved in researching?
Yeah, I'm not quite past my use by date yet, Martin, but I'm still actively interested in doing investigations. But there are a lot of up and coming active investigators. You know, there was Reece Dalton Morgan, that kind of thing. There's a lot of newer researchers coming into the scene, so I'm trying to actively support these researchers and do a lot of mentoring and that kind of stuff and sharing of information. So it's great to see that there is no shortage of people that are taking the time to look at the totality of the UFO history, but also look at the modern day phenomenon as well, and trying to do what I keep emphasising, the deep dive into the subject. And that means to really get into the subject and do the kind of hard work that's required. A lot of the times there's so much, I guess, armchair pontification that goes on, where it's pretty clear when you listen to some of these people that they haven't done any research. It's just subjective kind of responses, and you're kind of thinking they're getting more attention. It's just ridiculous. And again, I think people should, think about things critically, like have a listen to the credentials of the people that are making various statements, and take the time to carefully consider what these people are saying, what credibility they have, what kind of background, what kind of research they've done, and then draw conclusions, not a knee-jerk reaction. Yep.
I think that's wonderful advice, and it makes me happy that there's, people up and coming, and I feel the same. Like I look around and I see that there are younger people interested, and this is something that is such a puzzle, a wonderful puzzle to try to solve. So I'm going to kind of end the show on this. What would be, in your world, what you think would be a really big step forward in the UFO world? People always bring up the disclosure thing. I'm not sure if that's going to happen at any given point, but I mean, what do you see would be like a next really good step?
I think open scientific interest that's well funded, that kind of thing. It's pretty evident that it costs money to do serious investigation, and therefore there's got to be a degree of funding. But again, there's such a broad base of data, so much to be examined, and yet the standard criticism is, where's your evidence? And my retort to that is that people should be aware that the evidence is there. Look at it. It doesn't take much to understand that there's a huge body of information that's been there, and yet you've got this ongoing controversy, and much of it's fed by somewhat uninformed kind of dialogues and comments that go on in social media.
Exactly.
If only the amount of effort that's put into some of this commentary, if only that was actually put into actually seriously examining the subject and reviewing the documentation, that would be a major advance. And there's lots of organisations that are coming into play that have been newly formed that are doing a lot of good work, and it's pretty easy to recognise those. Yep, it's a fairly positive situation that's getting better and better.
Yes, well, Bill, I got to say, it's been such a pleasure, and I hope to have you back one day. You've just been, you've been a real positive thing in the UFO field in general. And like I mentioned in the very beginning, Charles Lear, who does all my blogs, and he does a lot of historic work. He's brought you into the blogs that he writes many times because of your wonderful research. And I just want to thank you for all that you've done.
Thank you very much. Glad to be appreciated.
Yes, you are. All right. So that's it for our show tonight. Thank you all very much. And we'll be back this Thursday with Ryan Kralik. And also next week, we have our guests coming up, even on Thanksgiving. So remember to keep your eyes to the sky, everyone.